They arrested her not because she was violent or dangerous, but simply because she was loud. Loud enough to shake a courtroom, loud enough to make a judge feel uneasy, and loud enough to expose a broken and racist system. This is the story of Evelyn Monroe, and it doesn't begin with a courtroom win, it begins with handcuffs. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a powerful story like this, and let us know in the comments where you're watching. Now back to Evelyn. On a cloudy morning in downtown Chicago, right outside the Cook County Courthouse, a peaceful crowd gathered. No signs, no riots, just strong voices calling out names and demanding justice. And at the center stood Evelyn, a 33-year-old black woman with gray locks and a voice sharper than a siren. She didn't come to cause trouble. She came because another unarmed teen had been shot, and she knew if she didn't speak up, no one would. Standing on those courthouse steps, she called out the truth. The judge inside had a shady history, quietly dismissing cases and giving bad cops a clean slate, and Evelyn didn't hold back. She named them all, one by one, and just like that, the courthouse doors burst open and sheriffs pushed through the crowd. People stepped back and pulled out their phones as one officer walked straight up to Evelyn and said, "You're causing a disturbance." But she calmly smiled and replied, "I'm quoting court transcripts." He didn't care. He handcuffed her on the spot with no Miranda rights, no real explanation, just a quiet message into his radio. "Contempt of court, bring her in." The protest kept going, but Evelyn's voice was gone, now trapped in the back of a police van, her face pressed against the cold glass, while the chants behind her slowly faded away. Inside, she didn't cry or scream. She simply looked at her hands, then her wrists, and then at the officer across from her, locking onto his badge number. 1 blink, 2, 3, burning it into her memory, because deep down, she already knew. This wasn't about breaking a rule, it was about fear. They were arresting her because she wasn't afraid of them, and that scared them more than anything. This was just the beginning, and what comes next will make you question everything you thought justice looked like. So stick around, because Evelyn Monroe didn't just survive this, she turned it into her strength. And by the end of this story, you'll see exactly how. The same people who threw her in that van would soon be the ones standing in front of her, begging for mercy. So don't miss what happens next. The courthouse basement was freezing, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, and the flickering fluorescent lights above buzzed like even they were tired. Evelyn sat silently in a hard plastic chair, her wrists still red from the handcuffs, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. A young officer walked by, did a double take, and whispered to another, "Isn't that Evelyn Monroe?" They nodded. "Crazy, right? Thought she was a lawyer or something." And she was. She'd won cases in this very courthouse, defended people whose lives depended on her voice. But now that same voice had landed her here, stripped of power and waiting for something far worse than a jail cell. That's when Officer Gregory Tully entered. 6'2", buzz cut, uniform tight, badge shining like he polished it just for show, and a greasy smile that screamed, "I own you." He looked at her like she was nothing more than property, glancing at his clipboard and saying, "Big mouth, huh?" She didn't respond. He stepped closer and said, "Contempt of court. You know what that means, don't you?" But still, she said nothing, her eyes locked on his badge, not blinking. He tapped the chair behind her and said, "Stand up, we're processing you, and that means haircut time." To which she calmly raised one eyebrow and said, "I'm not a prisoner." Tully laughed. "You're in here, ain't you?" She stood, not because he ordered it, but because she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of resistance. He led her to the chair. The room went quiet, and when another guard handed him scissors, Tully waved him off, saying, "Nah, clippers." Evelyn's hair, her thick silver locks, had taken her 20 years to grow. Every strand of Evelyn's hair carried stories, memories of her mother, protests she marched in, and courtrooms where she fought for the voiceless. But Tully didn't care, didn't even try to see that. To him it was just hair, and this was his favorite part of the job. He plugged in the clippers and the sickening buzz filled the room like a chainsaw, a warning. Evelyn sat perfectly still, feeling all the eyes on her, guards, inmates, even the ones trying not to look. Everyone watched as the first swipe came straight down the middle, slow and cruel. Not for neatness, but to hurt her, humiliate her. Chunks of her hair dropped onto her shoulders, her lap, the floor, like ash falling from a fire. Tully leaned in close and muttered, "This ain't your courtroom anymore," his breath hot against her ear, hoping she'd break, cry, scream, anything. But all he got was silence, and her eyes staring straight into his reflection on the steel table across from them, watching every move. When he was done, he spun the chair to face the mirror. Her locks were gone, her crown stripped away, red lines marking her scalp where he'd pressed too hard. And still she stood tall, not with shame, not even shock. Just a calm, deep breath. And a whisper so soft only he could hear it, "You're going to regret this." He laughed and said, "Oh yeah, and what are you going to do about it?" She didn't respond, but deep down she already knew. She was going to remember every second, every face that looked away, every hand that did nothing, every voice that stayed silent, and especially his. Because this wasn't just about humiliating her, it was the spark for something much bigger. And Greg Tully had just handed her the fuel. He just didn't realize it yet. Evelyn sat quietly in the holding cell, her hair gone, head still buzzing, not from the clippers, but from the rage boiling just beneath her skin. She didn't reach up to touch what had been stolen. She just sat still, hands folded, back straight, eyes fixed on the cold concrete wall in front of her. Across the hallway, two young officers whispered to each other. "That was messed up," one said. "She didn't even fight back." The other replied, "Yeah, that's what scares me." The silence Evelyn wore wasn't weakness. It was control, discipline, and something more. A warning. Hours passed with no food, no lawyer, no rights read, just waiting. And when they finally processed her paperwork, they labeled her as non-compliant, like she wasn't even human. Just something. To push through the system and forget. She never said a word as they pushed her through the system, like every other forgotten soul. But Evelyn Monroe was never meant to disappear. She was watching, storing everything, every officer's name, every face that looked away, every cruel laugh that echoed after her hair hit the floor. They thought they'd broken her, but they didn't break Evelyn. They shattered the illusion that the system could keep hiding what it really was. That night, alone in her cell, she finally touched her head. Not out of sorrow, but as a way to acknowledge the moment, like closing a chapter or sealing a scar. In the dull reflection of the tiny metal sink, she saw her new face. Not weak, not ugly, but raw, stripped and unapologetically real. A guard passed by, paused at her door and muttered, "Monroe, they're transferring you to county first thing in the morning." She nodded, then said something that made him freeze. "Tell Officer Tully of thank you." Confused, he asked, "For what?" Evelyn didn't blink. "For reminding me who the real enemy is, because before that haircut she still believed the system could be fixed from the inside. But now she knew the truth. It had to be torn down and built new from the ashes." When she walked out of that cell, she wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and a perfect memory of every man who tried to steal her dignity. County jail was louder, dirtier, more crowded, the kind of place where hope rarely visited, and justice was just another rumor passed from cell to cell. Like contraband, they threw Evelyn into general population as if she were just another number. In the system, no special treatment, no recognition, no mercy. She wore the same orange jumpsuit as everyone else, but she wasn't like everyone else. She had once stood in courtrooms and brought juries to tears, walked beside grieving mothers, holding their hands through verdicts, and trained public defenders, who still carried her voice in their minds. But none of that mattered here. To them, she was just a loud black woman who got too close to the fire and finally got burned. The other women in the unit watched her, some curious, some bitter, most silent. But one younger woman with a busted lip and eyes full of defiance finally spoke. "You really Evelyn Monroe?" Evelyn looked up and gave a single nod. "You? The one they shaved?" the girl asked again, and Evelyn nodded once more. The young woman grinned, chipped tooth showing, and said, "Good. I was starting to think you weren't real." And in that moment, Evelyn let herself smile just a little, because in this place full of forgotten souls, she was more legend than inmate. But she didn't care about being a legend, because legends don't change things, and Evelyn Monroe, wasn't here to be remembered. She was here to make something happen. She was preparing to become a weapon, reading every day, pacing every night, filing grievances she knew would be shredded the moment she turned them in, but doing it anyway just to remind them she still knew the rules. She just wasn't playing their game anymore. 3 weeks passed, then 4, and a court date came and went. No trial, no dropped charges, no hearing, just the same excuse. Contempt, which meant no timeline, no limit, just a punishment for making a judge feel small, not for breaking the law. Meanwhile, Officer Tully was still shaving heads, cracking jokes in the break room, walking around like nothing ever happened, thinking Evelyn would disappear, fade into silence, rot quietly in a forgotten cell. But she was doing the opposite. She was writing everything down, on napkins, commissary receipts, the backs of envelopes she never sent. Not just her own story, but what was happening to everyone else. Wrongful detainments, beatings in the shower, bribes for phone calls, medication being denied, and even women giving birth alone in solitary confinement. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a record, piece by piece, of a system that thought it could erase her. She hid the pages inside her mattress, folded into the lining of her jumpsuit, stuffed into toilet paper rolls, every scrap a record, a manifesto, a ticking time bomb. One day, a guard came to toss her cell and pulled out a bundle of folded paper, smirking. "What's all this?" Evelyn stood tall, calm, and said, "That's your future trial transcript." The guard laughed and tossed the papers back on her bunk, muttering crazy, but something in her voice unsettled him. Because she didn't sound like a prisoner, she sounded like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. That night, back in her bunk, she pulled out a single razor blade hidden inside her legal textbook and carved a small mark into the wall, just one. But she would carve one every week, not as a tally for survival, but as a strategy, a countdown, because Evelyn Monroe had no plans to die in that cell. She wasn't planning an escape. She was planning a return, and when she came back, it wouldn't be as a lawyer or an inmate. It would be as the woman they tried to erase, now armed with the one thing they couldn't take from her, the truth. It took 4 years. 4 years to rebuild a life torn apart in one afternoon. 4 years since her hair hit the floor and Officer Greg Tully walked away, thinking he'd won. The world may have forgotten Evelyn, but she never forgot them. Not the guard who rolled his eyes when she bled through her sheets and asked for a doctor. Not the warden who branded her a threat to facility morale for teaching inmates how to read court documents. Not the judge who grinned smugly while signing the contempt order that locked her away, and certainly not the cop who used buzzing clippers like a weapon. But Evelyn didn't return with a bat in hand. She came back with books, with plans, and with patience. After her release, she didn't go back to her old life because it was no longer there. Clients had abandoned her, the bar had buried her. Under red tape, the media had moved on, and the people who once cheered her in court now only whispered and turned away. She found a job at a community legal aid center. No salary, no office, just a pile of backlogged files and a phone that rarely rang. Yet Evelyn didn't complain. This time she had a purpose, something bigger. By day she fought evictions and advocated for tenants living in rat-infested apartments. By night she studied, reviewing ethics codes, judicial conduct exams, and municipal law loopholes. She wasn't just aiming to practice law again, she wanted to oversee it. And though everyone laughed, she wasn't deterred. When Evelyn applied to the Judicial Review Board, even her mentor, an old professor who once called her the most brilliant legal mind in a decade, told her softly, "They'll never let you in." Evelyn, not after what happened. She smiled and replied, "Then I'll make them regret not doing it sooner." And just like that, Evelyn Monroe started passing every test, every panel, every closed-door interview. She was smarter, sharper, and more focused than anyone they'd seen in years. They tried to bury her in paperwork, but she turned it in early. They brought up her arrest, and she presented court transcripts, witness statements, and internal memos proving it was retaliation. By the time she made it to the final round of judicial vetting, one of the senior committee members whispered, "She scares me." Another responded, "Good, that means she's ready." And one early morning before the sun rose over Chicago's cold skyline, Evelyn Monroe stood in front of the mirror, her hair grown back short, sharp, and powerful, stronger than before. She put on the black robe for the first time. It was heavy, it was earned, and it was about to change everything. That day, Judge Monroe stepped into the same courthouse where she'd once been dragged in chains, the same building where her identity had been stripped away like it was nothing. She walked through the metal detectors with no fear. Staff looked up from their desks. Some recognized her, others stared as if they were seeing a ghost, but she wasn't a ghost. She was the reckoning. At 10:03 a.m., her clerk handed her the first case file of the day. She opened the folder, paused, and her eyes locked on the name. Defendant, Officer Gregory Tully. Charge, police brutality, tampering with evidence, falsifying reports. For just a second, the air seemed to leave the room. She almost smiled, not because she was happy, but because fate had delivered him to her doorstep, wrapped in legal ink. She closed the folder, stood up from her chair and walked into the courtroom, the same courtroom where they once called her an inmate. But this time, she was sitting at the highest seat in the room. The Eye. Man who had once shaved her head was about to stand before her, his hands shaking, his past finally catching up with him. The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, but justice had already entered the room. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Law students sat stiffly, notebooks ready. People didn't know why this particular case felt different, but the energy in the air made it clear something was coming. And then he walked in. Gregory Tully. Same buzzcut, same broad shoulders, but none of the swagger. His uniform was gone, replaced by a cheap suit and a nervous lawyer whispering in his ear. He scanned the room casually at first, like it was just another routine appearance, but then he saw her, up on the bench, black robe, hair short and silver now, no longer flowing but sharp like a blade. Her eyes were locked on the docket, not even acknowledging him. He froze. A step, then another, until he stood there, jaw slightly open, lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but forgot how. His lawyer leaned in and whispered, "You okay, Tully?" He didn't answer, because in that exact moment he realized who he was standing in front of, the woman he humiliated, the woman he thought was broken, the woman whose hair he had scattered on a courtroom floor. And now she was the one holding the gavel. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Monroe." The entire room stood, everyone, even Tully, his knees shaky, his palms already sweating. Evelyn didn't look at him. Not yet. She adjusted her glasses, reviewed the file, and then finally spoke. "Mr. Tully, you stand before this court accused of aggravated assault, falsifying police records, excessive force, and misconduct in uniform. How do you plead?" Tully's lawyer cleared his throat. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her eyes slowly rose from the file and locked directly on him for the first time. Dead silence. No emotion. No smile. Just the weight of memory in her stare. She leaned forward, just, slightly, and said calmly, "I will remind the defendant that this is a court of law, not a barbershop." Tully flinched. The room stayed frozen. No laughs, no whispers. She leaned back in her chair, gavel still untouched, her voice steady. "You will be tried here by the book because, unlike you, Mr. Tully, I believe in due process." The trial began. Witnesses took the stand. A young man, just 17, testified, his jaw still wired shut from a baton strike. A mother cried as she described her son's arrest over a broken taillight and how he came home with bruises on his spine. One of Tully's own officers took the stand and admitted, "Finally, I've seen him do worse." Each testimony was a nail, each document a coffin board, and Tully said nothing. He just sat there, face drained, staring at the woman he once called powerless. But Judge Monroe didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She listened. She ruled fairly. She made her court a place where the truth could finally speak. And that's what terrified Tully the most. In that courtroom, Evelyn didn't seek revenge. She gave him exactly what he never gave her, justice. But this trial was far from over, and what came next would make the Clippers incident look like mercy. On day 3 of the trial, the courtroom wasn't just full, it was buzzing. People lined up outside before the doors even opened. Law students skipped classes just to watch. Reporters took shifts like it was a marathon. Even former inmates sat quietly in the back waiting. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a reckoning. Gregory Tully sat slumped in his chair, the arrogance long gone. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his eyes hollow. He wasn't the predator in the room anymore. He was the prey, and the courtroom, that was the cage. He used to control, but now Judge Evelyn Monroe had the keys. The prosecution brought more evidence: body cam footage, muted timestamps, edited files that should have been filed mysteriously. Missing. One after another, the lies stacked up like bricks, each one heavier than the last. A young black woman took the stand. "I was 17, she said. "I had headphones in. I didn't hear him tell me to stop." She paused, her hands shaking. "When I turned around, he already had me on the ground. My shoulders never healed right." Her mother cried silently in the back row. Tully didn't look at her. He couldn't. Another witness took the stand, a retired officer. "I told Internal Affairs twice, nothing happened." He cleared his throat. "I was told to keep quiet, that Tully was protected." Judge Monroe tilted her head at that word. Protected. It was the same word they used when they stripped her of her hair, her license, her dignity, protocol, procedure, policy, all just fancy masks for silence. But now the silence was cracking. And Evelyn? She was doing what they said she never could, cleaning the rot from the inside. During recess, Tully tried to make eye contact with her. She didn't even look his way because this wasn't personal anymore. It was surgical. She was cutting. The infection out, slowly, precisely, and legally, because that's what scared the system more than anything. Not violence, not protests, but a black woman in a robe who knew the law better than the people who once used it against her. When court resumed, Evelyn leaned forward, her voice calm but ice-cold. "Mr. Tully, you will be required to testify under oath tomorrow morning. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges and immediate detention." Tully's lawyer objected, stammering something about mental fatigue. Evelyn didn't even blink. Objection noted, overruled. The gavel hit the wood with one sharp crack, and that sound echoed through the room like thunder. It wasn't just a gavel anymore. It was a signal. The game was over. Tomorrow, the man who used to shave heads like trophies would be under oath. Stripped bare, not by clippers, but by truth, and this time everyone would be watching. It was the fourth day, and the courtroom was silent. Gregory Tully sat alone in the witness chair, sweating, not from the heat, but from the pressure. He'd been coached, he'd practiced his answers, but none of that mattered now because in front of him sat the one person he could never lie to, Judge Evelyn Monroe. She didn't lean forward, didn't threaten. She just stared at him, and in that stare was everything he'd tried to bury. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Gregory Tully," he muttered. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" He hesitated. The silence dragged on. Then he finally said, "Yes." The questioning began. At first he denied everything, said the footage was misleading, said the injuries were exaggerated, said he was just doing his job. But then came the cross-examination. "Mr. Tully," the prosecutor asked, "do you remember processing a woman named Evelyn Monroe 4 years ago?" He froze. The entire courtroom leaned forward just slightly, like the room was holding its breath. "Yes," he said quietly. "Do you recall shaving her head?" He blinked, licked his lips, his throat moved, but no sound came out at first. "Yes," he finally muttered. "Did she resist?" "No." "Was it necessary?" "No." Judge Monroe still hadn't moved. She didn't need to, because now he was doing the cutting for her. "Do you regret it?" the prosecutor asked. Tully looked at her finally, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who she was." The prosecutor turned slowly toward the bench. "And if you had known?" Tully said nothing because everyone already knew the answer. The prosecutor nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." There was a pause, and then Evelyn finally spoke. "Just one question, Mr. Tully. If the robe I wear now makes you nervous, why didn't my humanity make you pause back then?" Tully stared at her, like a man watching the ground open beneath him. No answer, no defense, just silence, and that's when she picked up the gavel. Sentencing was swift. 10 years in federal prison, no early release, dishonorable discharge, permanent ban from law enforcement. But Evelyn didn't stop there. She ordered an independent review of every case Tully ever touched, therapy access for his victims, and she made sure every name, every forgotten face was added to the public record. Because justice doesn't whisper, it writes history. As court adjourned, Tully was let out in cuffs, the same way Evelyn had once been dragged in. Full circle. Outside, the media flooded the steps, microphones, cameras, and flashing lights. A reporter shouted, "Judge Monroe, any final words for Officer Tully?" She stopped, looked right into the lens, and said, "He tried to reduce me to nothing, but I remembered who I was." You don't need revenge when you have accountability, and justice doesn't always come fast, but when it does, it comes with a gavel in hand.